Hello, guys. And just a war ago, I was a completely civilian person, avoiding all topics about anything military. I did not like that, including war films, war books, but Russian invasion, full scale invasion of Ukraine changed everything in our lives and in my life, including the attitudes. And I'm very happy that today on the channel we will have an opportunity to speak with a great military analyst, a person whose videos I love watching, and honestly, they often change my perspective on some moments as this war develops. So I'm really happy to talk today with Anders Pak Nielsen. Hello.
Hello, and thanks for the invitation.
Thank you so much once again. And I'm a little bit worried because, once again, I'm 100% or 300% civilian person. So please forgive if some of my questions will be more emotional than professional. But the very first question is already a traditional one, and I address all of the guests on the channel with it. Because for me, I don't know, maybe it's personal, maybe it's interesting for every Ukrainian. Russia attacked Ukraine in 2014, but still it was often described as a local conflict, as an anti-terroristic operation, and then the full-scale war began in February 2022. And honestly, knowing Russian history, suffering from Russia for centuries, many of us here in Ukraine still believed it was impossible. Like aviation bombing cities in the 21st century, no. It is irrational, it is illogical, but Russia is irrational and illogical. So, my very first question to you as a professional military analyst, did you see it coming? Did you believe that this kind of full scale war, quite similar to the Second World War, could start in 2022 in Europe?
Let me start by saying that you're maybe not the only one here who's maybe uncertain or nervous a bit, because I always feel kind of nervous when talking to people from Ukraine, because I'm used to talking to people in the West. I kind of have an idea of what do people know, what are the general assumptions, but when actually talking to people in Ukraine, I'm always so concerned about, trying to sound smart or something on a topic that you know a lot more about than I do. But about the war and the outbreak of the invasion, I'll say definitely in the last 2.5 years, I've been saying sentences that I never thought I would be saying. Right? That these are things that are just something from a different age, right? You thought that, okay, this is how we talk about the Second World War or something like that, and suddenly we're talking about these things in real time, and it's actually happening. So in that sense, it's been strange for me, also as a military analyst, to actually go through this and experience that. But I will say, I was actually not surprised in 22. I think I was one of those who actually did see it coming and did say that I thought there was going to be an invasion, and also that it was going to be a big one, that this was not going to be just something local, an escalation in the Donbass or something, but that Russia was really going in for the whole thing. And I also think I actually was right about seeing that it was not going to be successful, that Russia clearly misunderstood the situation, that Putin had very wrong ideas about Russia's strengths and Ukraine's weaknesses. So I think I got that quite right. And then, of course, I've been surprised about many things after. It's one thing to see that the war will begin, but how it's going to develop, and that there have been many surprises along the way. But I do think it wasn't a total shock to me when Russia came out with this list of ultimatums. I think it was in December of 21. I think that was really when I started to realize that how serious this is, and it just didn't make sense. And it took me a couple of weeks to just think about what is it actually that we're seeing. Why would they do this? How does this compare to the buildups we're seeing on the border and other things? And I I sort of, on the basis of that, was felt pretty certain that this had to develop toward an invasion.
February is quite a gloomy, dark month in Ukraine, both from this climate perspective, but also because that's the time when we commemorate Heavenly Hundred. And there are lots of sad anniversaries, and people in general are quite depressed with this no sunlight, memories of bad dark days. And I do remember this spirits, like you're trying to persuade yourself this is just them showing off on the borders, but at the same time, this banks of blood, hospitals, and other things that try telling something's gonna happen. You have beautifully described the surprises that also saved Ukraine to some extent. And people here often say that Ukraine is the new geographical discovery for many peoples in the West, across the ocean. And actually, one of the compliments that we receive here is, "You're normal. You're so just like us." And all because of this Iron Cat, and also because we did not work that well to tell our story after the renewed independence. But my next question maybe will be a little bit more positive. What did surprise you at the very start of this invasion, once again, about Ukraine? Because the majority of those who are our great supporters right now were convinced that Ukraine will collapse in a couple of weeks.
Mm. Yeah, I think most people expected the Russian military to be better, and I think also there was a general tendency to underestimate what the Ukrainian military is capable of. And some of that is probably based on sort of watching what happened in 2014. And at that time, the Ukrainian military really, it didn't look too good. But I think just many people had not really realized how much change there had been in those 8 years. And of course, there is nothing like not performing well on the battlefield that can sort of start a wave of innovation, right? And you start looking at what didn't work, and you're willing to make the kinds of changes that really are necessary. And I think once the invasion started rolling, it was very clear that the Ukrainian military, they had thought about this. There were plans about what to do. And they knew the Russian enemy. They knew who they were up against, and knew what are sort of their weaknesses that they could be exploited in the early phases of the war. So I think it was a surprise to many people, including myself, that Russia did not do better than they actually did. But I think also we have to remember, though, that it's also because of these misunderstandings in the Russian leadership, that the wrong conceptions that Putin had about Ukraine and how the war would be won, and that Ukraine was this fragile state. You really did, they almost didn't have to do anything. That was the idea, right? They could just come in, and then Ukraine would not do anything, and all the Russian-speaking Ukrainians would rise up against the Ukrainian-speaking Ukrainians, and you would have like a counter Maidan revolution, or those ideas that they had, right? So it seems to me that despite all this with the blood banks and those things, they didn't actually prepare a real invasion. So I think that we also have to remember that when they started rolling into that's also one of the reasons actually why I felt that Russia was probably not going to be successful if they started this. We were talking a lot at that time about 100,000 soldiers that Russia had amassed on the borders, right? Today, we're used to numbers that are much bigger than that, right? You have like 100,000 soldiers, thinking you could take all of Ukraine with that. It just sounds silly. But when you look at where the war is today, so clearly Russia was, starting on something that they had not actually prepared for. And so I think Ukraine got off to a good start because of good preparation and innovative thinking in those 8 years leading up to that. And Russia got off to a really bad start because they just had absolutely wrong assumptions about what kind of war they were getting into.
Yeah, honestly, many of us were observing what was happening at the very start, and everyone was afraid that others would decide to give up. And when we finally felt that, like, nobody wants to give up, everybody wants to finally end this war that honestly lasted on these territories for more than 300 years, starting from the Russian Empire, continuing in the Soviet Union, and now with the so-called Russian Federation that wants to restore this imperial myth. And Russian propaganda perhaps is partially what deceived Russians themselves. They started believing these messages about the second strongest army in the world. Now, then we spoke about second strongest army in Ukraine, and there are new jokes describing them as second strongest army in Russia after Ukrainian soldiers in Kursk. And one of these very popular narratives that Putin spread, especially inside the country and to the countries of the global south and so on, that there are NATO bases in Ukraine. Unfortunately, not yet. there are no. And my next question will be connected with NATO. Ukraine is definitely a country that wants to join NATO. Speaking to Ukrainian soldiers, I feel they have become more confident, and they actually think that not only NATO can be useful for them, but they can also be useful for NATO with their experience, like this combat experience. And like the support growth, it was especially high at the very start of invasion. Sometimes when NATO says no to Ukraine, people get a little bit disappointed, but in general, the support is very, very high, the highest perhaps during all the years of independence. And those who were always pro-NATO citizens, they believe that it was the greatest mistake not to invite Ukraine, or at least to develop a plan for Ukraine joining NATO in 2008. After the Orange Revolution, peaceful revolution, Ukraine was very ready to join NATO, European Union, and many believe this could actually save thousands of Ukrainian lives lost during these 10 years of Russia's war against us. So my next question will be like 3 questions. How do you think, was Ukraine ever like ready to join the NATO before the invasion, be it 2008, 2014? Are we ready now? Because once again, inside Ukraine, there are different versions. We need to end the conflict. No, this will never happen. Or we can enter with the territories that is not occupied, and so on. What is your opinion about the past and the future of Ukraine with NATO?
I think both Ukraine and NATO was very different in 2008. I think definitely a strong argument can be made that if NATO expansion had happened faster, then we could have avoided much of what is going on now. But I also think we just have to see at that time NATO was an organization that was really mostly focused on Iraq, Afghanistan, those kinds of operations. That nobody really thought that a war with Russia was going to be a relevant discussion again, right? And the Ukrainian military at the time definitely had a wrong kind of profile, I guess, for that type of scenario. But I mean, a lot has changed, and I will say that there are definitely countries that also joined NATO before 2008 that were pretty much had the same kind of military. So it's not. I don't think that should be excluded. That was a reason to exclude Ukraine at the time. It was a political discussion, and actually, I'd like to turn that question around to you a little bit, because I think my impression was that in 2008, it was really a hot topic in Ukraine, but it was not a clear-cut thing, that there was actually, at the time, a strong majority in the population in support for that. If you look at
I think
opinion polls at the time.
by 2008, Russia had started its hybrid war very seriously, and it was a reaction for the Orange Revolution of 2004. if it had started in 2004, the support was very high. But Russia always uses the mistakes of Ukraine and the mistakes of allies to prepare anti-NATO campaigns, pro-Russian campaigns, trying to change the attitudes of the population, or at least of the leading parties. That's what we observe right now in Georgia, that is ready to say sorry to the occupied territories, and it's insane. And it does not reflect the attitudes of the population, at least from what I see, what I feel. But that's what they do. That's what they may continued Russian war in 2022, after they saw weak reaction in 2014 for the annexation of Crimea. So I think that by 2008 they did a lot of work to prevent Ukraine from even moving in that direction. Not all the polls can be very realistic, because quite soon Yanukovych, who was a totally pro-Russian created president, came to power, and then all the discourses, they were very different. But in general, I'd say 2004 was the year when Ukraine was very ready. Honestly, I think even to join the European Union. I always stay politically correct, and I never name the countries who are members of NATO or EU. And they had serious troubles with corruption. They had long periods of dictatorship, even worse than it was in Ukraine. They had more economic problems, but they were smaller and less tasty for Russia.
Absolutely. I think you're right about that. And so it's also just, I think, to some extent a question of what was the sort of order of countries that you got to. Like in the beginning, everyone could get in because it was a new time, and then by the time in 2008, there started to come some questions about it, and Russia had really started to, be vociferous about how they were against that. So. But from a military point of view, absolutely, Ukraine has to. Is ready today to be in NATO, and I think I will make two points about that, about Ukrainian NATO membership today. The first one is, I think it will have to be a part of any kind of peace negotiation thing, right? That there is right now a strange sort of conversation, I think, in the West about how can the war end, and it's very much about territory. And this question about security guarantees for Ukraine is sort of pushed aside, and so it's like, well, we will have to look at that on the other side when once the peace is there, we will figure out how what the security arrangements will be for that. I just don't see that happening at all. I mean, these things are connected. Why on earth would Ukraine go in on a peace deal where you give up territory and you don't get any security guarantees or NATO membership or anything like that? So there has in the West to be an understanding that this is a discussion we really need to have, and we need to have it now, and that these things go hand in hand. We can't ask Ukraine to make compromises on one area and then not give something on another. So that's one thing I want to say. And the other thing, you kind of hinted at before, that Ukraine has something to offer also to NATO, and I think especially to Europe. I think it's extremely important that we really realize how important that is. That we are seeing a shift where the Americans are pulling back from this role as those who guarantee the security of all of Europe, and are willing to take on that responsibility, especially if Donald Trump is elected. There are big questions about what would be the consequences for NATO in Europe, and I think the European countries really need to understand that if we have to balance against Russia going forward without the United States as a backing, we have to have Ukraine on our side, right? There is no way that we can do this without Ukraine. The Ukrainian army is today the strongest army in Europe. Maybe we can discuss, maybe Russia is more, but if we look at what is the Western Bloc, then absolutely Ukraine is stronger. It's much stronger than the German, the British, the French army, right? We should not have any illusions about this. If we want to be able to balance against Russia going forward, Ukraine has to be a part of our alliance. and also just the defense industry that Ukraine has today, the ability to produce these things at mass. We really see Western Europe struggling to to provide the things we promised to give to Ukraine. Right? Ukraine actually does have this defense industry that would just be super important in a future conflict. So just in a very primitive sense, we can say if Russia wins, Ukraine goes to Russia. If Ukraine wins, Ukraine is on the Western side. If we want to be able to deal with this going forward, Ukraine has to be on our side.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you so much for these words and for sharing them in your videos too, because indeed, there are lots of things lacking from conversations among the global leaders when, first of all, they don't treat Ukraine as the nation that decides for ourselves too. And believe me, no one in Ukraine will accept giving up territories, getting nothing, and just waiting for another start of the full-scale invasion, to give Russia time to mobilize more people, get more missiles from North Korea. Nobody will allow that. And the majority of messages that even tired Ukrainian soldiers repeat, they want to end this war and not to pass it on to their children, to the future generations of Ukrainians. And another reason that all of those, including Donald Trump, who believe Putin wants to end this war, actually make a great mistake. Putin wants war. He does not want peace. He does not want territories in Ukraine. He needs wars. And after Ukraine, he's ready to continue further. With all of this, and one of his tasks, actually, Putin's, is to undermine global world order, to demonstrate that international agreements do not work. Look, International Criminal Court issued an order, and he's traveling to Mongolia and leaving it non-arrested. And he also tries to undermine NATO, United Nations, all the other institutions that actually help this world, very diverse, very complex, to operate. Do you think there is some need to reform something in NATO, especially taking into account this new types of warfare or countries that have different opinion, like, Turkey, Slovakia, Hungary can be quite unpredictable. So is there a need to change something inside NATO or not?
There is definitely a need for Europe to take a bigger responsibility than has been the case in the past. Europe has basically been cutting down on defense for 30 years, and now we see that was probably a mistake. And we are seeing the trend where the United States is withdrawing more and more. So I hope there will be a transition where this will be a gradual process where Europe will have the time to do it, and that's really my biggest concern about Donald Trump maybe being elected, having a second term, and accelerating some of these things, where basically just withdrawing the United States from the whole European theater. And what can the consequences be of that? That there will not be enough time for the European countries to go in and fill that void. I think that is the biggest transition if we look at NATO as a whole. And then obviously we have to deal with these various, there are different agendas, and we have the Southern European countries that are very concerned about problems of migration, for example, across the Mediterranean, which is a big problem for them. And there is a need for the different countries in NATO to understand the security concerns of others, and not just all insist that our security concerns are the only ones that are real. But I do think that transition away from that the United States as the all dominating power into a country where the European countries take more responsibility, that is the big transition. And then you will always have these sort of, Turkey plays this role, right? It's kind of a spoiler role. We have the Hungarians also doing some of that. But I think in general, those problems have been managed so far on a sort of case by case basis, and I guess that will continue to be the way to do that. it might be a bigger problem actually within the EU,
Mhm.
but where uh, that deals with sort of a broader scope of issues than NATO does.
Thank you. And here we approach one of my favorite and quite emotional questions, and that is about the interception of drones and missiles that not accidentally cross the borders of NATO countries. But I want to start sharing a funny story. Recently, I had a business trip, and you cannot fly out of Ukraine. We don't have normal airplanes in the skies. That's insane. And you have to travel to Poland. And that was exactly a day after they've lost a drone on their territory. And one of the first comments was that they could not stop it because of aerial conditions or something like that. And I was traveling, and I live 80 kilometers from Poland, really close to the border, and we had super clear sky, no fog, like nothing. I can literally see there is nothing in the skies. And another thing about this abnormal Ukrainians is that we have borders, we have customs, we have to show passports and other stuff. And they may ask you, what is the reason of your visit to Poland? And I literally answered that, well, you cannot find a drone, Russian drone, so I'm coming to look for it. They still did not, they were laughing, they still did not find it. And I have watched your video. And by the way, I greatly advise those of you who don't follow Anders' channel to subscribe. We will leave the links in the description of this video. Believe me, he definitely makes me smarter in lots of military aspects. So I advise you, if this war continues, and hopefully we will be able to stop it while still on the territory of Ukraine, but it's better to be prepared. And you have a really good video that changed a lot in my attitude about this lack of reaction from Ukrainian perspective, that Russian drones have traveled already to Romania, to Latvia, to Poland, and they were not shut down. Many describe it as a desire to avoid escalation. My least favorite story was when a Russian missile spent 39 seconds in the space of Poland, threatening Polish people. And as a Ukrainian, it was very painful to hear phrases like, we knew it will return back to Ukraine. And then people start saying, we will help you reconstruct your country, but you cannot reconstruct human lives. And it's a million times better to prevent destruction than to reconstruct it later. Also, traveling once again to this airfield, I've seen, and it's literally visible, it's not a secret information, 10 patriots standing around one airfield, and they will not use them to stop neither drones nor missiles. And we don't have enough to protect cities like Kyiv, where really people die because of lack of this. Do you still think that it's not Russia testing the countries, whether they are ready to react, but just performing informational special operations? Why countries do not shoot down Russian drones on their territory when it's totally legal, and can it change in the future?
Yeah, that was my the idea that I was pushing in that video you talked about. That I think we should understand these provocations as information operations. It's Russia's way of trying to push a certain narrative in the West. They want us to be concerned. They want us to make a big deal out of these things so that we will use more military resources on protecting our own borders instead of sending all this to Ukraine, and especially trying to get a debate going, or a popular push, you can say, a demand from the public that we need to protect ourselves instead of helping the Ukrainians. And I think to some extent we can actually see it the way, in Ukrainian officials talk a lot about why did we go into Kursk? Why do we do these long-range strikes into Russia? Well, it's important to bring the war home to the Russians so that they feel the consequences of this war, and the Russian population will maybe put pressure on the Russian politicians to end the war. And essentially, this is Russia's way of doing the same to Western Europe. Right? They're trying to bring the war home to Western Europe so that there will be less resources to send to Ukraine. I think that's the idea, and I think that's what we've seen throughout the whole war from the very beginning. That the Western countries and the NATO alliance has just agreed that we do not want any kind of confrontation with Russia, and when there are these things, we are not going to do anything to talk it up. We're just going to, put a lid on it, ignore it, pretend it didn't happen, and then there's no problem. We're just going to focus on helping Ukraine. I think that was a great idea if we then did everything we could to help Ukraine, right? But now we are in the situation where the war is dragging out, and it's I think it's going to be harder and harder to keep this strategy going. It's not just about the drones, by the way. It's also about other things, but it's just very visible with the drones. And I think we're having this discussion now because Russia is escalating the hybrid attacks on the West. So now they are done with drones, right? And they're going to be more and more visible. And as Russia, I think we are progressing toward Russia coming more and more under pressure. Eventually, probably this is going to, if the Western support for Ukraine is going to remain high, I think the direction we're going in is that Russia is eventually going to lose the war. And as that happens, they will be more and more aggressive about escalating these hybrid attacks on the West and trying to see if that is what will change the tide and make us stop helping Ukraine. So I think it's probably not sustainable in the long run. I think the Russians are just going to escalate this until they get the kind of reaction that they really want in the Western countries. But so far, it's still the idea. Just let's just see if we can ignore this, pretend it didn't happen. It's a lot easier to explain that a drone that flew past and then exited again, that it wasn't a big deal, than if it actually crashes somewhere on the ground. And that just, it's a lot harder to explain on TV.
Yeah, it's a lot harder to explain to Ukrainians because, it's not meant for you children. It's meant for Ukrainian children to destroy their hospital or their
Yeah,
school.
exactly. You get into this, and that is a really tough dilemma because you have that one Shahid drone, right? And you know what that is going to do when it hits something inside of Ukraine, and you have that moral dilemma: do you shoot it down, or do you allow it to hit that thing inside Ukraine? But if you shoot it down, then potentially, there might be some strategic consequences that could be worse, right? So I think that's the idea. I'm not saying it's the right choice. I just think that's the idea.
It was a very interesting video for me. It was to a great extent an eye-opener, and I honestly and sincerely think that's the way you describe it. I mean, on this level of decision makers, that let's not frighten people with shootings on our borders so that they keep supporting Ukraine. But what I observe, and I want to believe, sometimes people are much braver than those decision makers. I mean, people on the ground. And it's always interesting how people watch our videos, what they do, I don't know, drink, walk, and sometimes I literally quarrel with people whom I watch. So one of these moments that I was ready to quarrel with this decision was actually that everything is wrong if we look at this war from the perspective helping Ukraine, supporting Ukraine, happening in Ukraine, instead of defeating Russia. Russia is a criminal. Russia is a war criminal that broke all international agreements, crossed the border of the independent country. And in my videos, I often try to change this. I know it's impossible already because it was all about good things like helping Ukraine survive. But I have this dream that people stop helping Ukraine, but just focus on the defeat of Russia, total military defeat of Russia. Stop helping Ukraine, defeat Russia, and we're okay. So when finally this
Yeah,
decision will be made, because at this moment many countries still hope they can restore relations even with Putin. After Bucha, after Mariupol, after children's cancer hospital destroyed, after the destruction of Kakhovka Dam, they still think that the restorations of relations are possible, and let's not do something that will prevent that.
I think partly yes. I mean, definitely there will be some countries, and probably those not immediately bordering Ukraine or the Baltics or something. But if we go,
Russia.
yeah,
I mean,
no, no,
immediately bordering Russia.
yeah,
Those
immediately bordering Russia, yeah. But I mean, other countries will have those ideas that maybe we can somehow get back to it. But I think another problem that Ukraine is up against is this fear of escalation, and I think. Um, if we look at the American approach, really, I mean, what Biden has been saying again and again, I think he envisions certain different kinds of escalation. One of the kinds of escalation that like the whole strategy has been about how do we prevent this war from escalating, and
Mhm.
one of the types of escalation is actually Ukraine losing. So I think it seems to me that in the American leadership, there is a very strong idea that Putin will not stop with Ukraine, right? If Putin wins and takes all of Ukraine, then that will not stop the war. It will just keep going into other countries. Biden has said this many times, but on the other side, there is also the danger, the fear that if Putin gets really angry, then he can escalate the war, or if Russia is destabilized enough, and we have a kind of a Putin sitting there trying to hold on to power inside of Russia, that is also dangerous, and that can also lead to escalation. And that has led to this paradoxical American policy where Ukraine is getting enough help to make sure that Russia cannot win, but not enough help to actually that Ukraine can win either, because they're afraid that what can happen if Russia is suddenly destabilized, right? So you end up in that really weird situation where the goal sort of seems to be just to contain the war where it is, and not to actually end the war. I think it's been a wrong policy. I think that actually dragging the war out is making things worse. I think if we look at where the war is now, then it is dramatically escalated to compared to where it was a year ago. Just within the last couple of months, we have had the war has moved into Russia. We've had these massive long range strikes into Russia that Ukraine has conducted. Um, and I think this process is continuing. I think this actually dragging the war out is a more certain way to escalation. But the reason we've ended up in this is because we've had this American policy where really neither side has been allowed to win. And it's been kind of weird to watch.
Yeah, and it's very painful here inside Ukraine because unfortunately, all these delays and indecisiveness, it's not just about days, months, or years. It's not just about new cities destroyed, beautiful cities destroyed. It's about the lives of our best. Because on the Ukrainian side, especially millions of those who volunteered, these are the best people who had totally different lives before war. They also were civilians, they had different dreams, and they are fighting. And we are losing them. And Russia does not send their best people,
Not yet.
not yet.
No, no. I mean, but they will have to at some point. I mean,
But
yeah.
yeah, if but once again, if it's a continuous exhaustion war, we have fewer people. Like we are a smaller country. We are big in comparison to many EU countries, but we are not that big. That's why only innovation, only modern technologies can help us win.
Yeah, that's true. But Russia is running out of people that are willing to do it for money, really. So eventually they will have to also start taking some of those steps toward mobilization that Ukraine is taking right now. And I know that there's a huge debate in Ukraine about it and many different views on it. And that's just another
You
step
mean
of,
Ukrainian or Russian mobilization?
yeah. Right now there's a Ukrainian mobilization, right? But and
Everything. went
Yeah.
much better now. It was quite problematic at the beginning, but right now they have changed some attitudes to recruiting, de-Sovietized it, and gave people more choice. So in general, we have now again a problem. We have 14 new brigades and equipment for just 4 of them.
Yeah, that's definitely a problem. But anyways, my point is, I think that's going to be another step in this whole escalation, where Russia will also have to do that. The way they are running their manning system is not, it's not sustainable. They can't keep on just finding people willing to do it for money. So I think it's, I mean, I'm not that pessimistic about Ukraine's opportunities for winning a war of attrition against Russia, because the way I see it, the Russian economy, the way the whole Russian system is built around fighting this war is not sustainable. And I think Budanov was out, General Budanov was out like a couple of weeks ago talking about how Russia will have to try to win this war before 2026,
Yeah.
because over the next year they're going to run into more and more bottlenecks. I think that's absolutely right.
Yes, and one very important factor that many people do not take into account is this Ukrainian determination and motivation. For us, this is an existential fight. It's not about like economic things, or it's about the survival of the nation. And even in those very dark times when we did not have any supplies and people literally lacked artillery shells on the front lines, that was, by the way, one of the reasons that also slowed down the motivation to conscript, because people realized they cannot fight, they simply try to survive in the trenches. But even in these days, everyone in Ukraine wanted to continue fighting. No one wanted negotiations, giving up territories, and becoming a part of Russia. And you are like very right in your observation that it is either Ukraine securing the democratic West, as we people want in Ukraine, which is also important, I hope. And another, that some people are killed, some people flee the country, and some are mobilized into the Russian army, as they do now on temporarily occupied territories without the will or decision of people, and sent further with maybe even weapons from the partners to invade, let's say, the Baltics, this Suwalki, oh my God, what's the Beresheyuk? I know the
Gap.
Ukrainian, but you know, the small part that connects. Or Poland, or something like that. Do you think that people in Europe and in the world now realize this is a real threat, and it's not a local conflict about some natural resources on a limited territory of Ukraine? It's about the restoration of this Russian zone of influence, I don't know, Eastern Bloc.
Um, it's a good question. I think those who follow the war and follow what's going on, of course, understand this. But unfortunately, I think a lot of people just don't follow it that closely. And I mean, one of the ways that I judge these things, or like, where is the public? It's on the questions I get from journalists, really about this, and you know, it really depends on how much news, how much is Ukraine in the news, what do people know, and it always surprises me how quickly people forget, and then they go on to something different, and I keep on trying to push this awareness that this war that is going on in Ukraine and in Russia, I'm trying to teach myself to call it the war in Ukraine and Russia now. But it's one of the one one of the things I'm always trying to say is that we need to understand that this is a war that is important for our security in a way that other wars just aren't.
Mhm.
So there is a lot of focus on Hezbollah right now and this pager attack that Israel conducted, and it gets a lot of attention in the news, and suddenly that is everywhere, and it's really hard to find the Ukraine news. So it's just I think honestly, many people have a hard time distinguishing these things and keeping an eye for what is important and what could really be the consequences. And ironically, as I said before, the war in Ukraine is really escalate. It's in a sort of phase of escalation right now, where it's spreading. It's going on in more places, and I think we're gradually Russia is being pushed into making more and more dramatic choices as things get harder for them. But at the same time, at least right now, it seems to be getting a lot less attention in the news here, which is a kind of strange way.
Well, some people choose also to avoid negative things, you know. I was surprised to learn that lots of fact checking organizations claim that there are more and more people who say, we don't want facts. We just want to live in our safe environment. And Russia likes this kind of attitude because it's much easier to spread fears and threats that may actually be very unrealistic because they cannot take like Ukrainian villages, so it's not very likely they will take half of Europe or all of Europe. But they keep repeating that, and it's all doubled by old Soviet propaganda myths. And you know, whenever I speak with the media or else from Europe, let's say, or the US, I realize that it's not the one layer of propaganda. It's just like the parents and the grandparents. Everyone was brought up on these messages and they are taken for granted. And it's really difficult to debunk those messages about Russian strands, about like Ukraine being a part of Russia or something like that. I had questions like, do you speak Soviet? And no, I don't. Thank you so much for everything that you do explaining these complex topics in a very clear and sane way, and actually quite soothing and calming from this Ukrainian environment. And one thing I can guarantee you that no one in Ukraine wants to give up and plans to give up, whether with this support or not. There is no way we will pause or start negotiating with people who killed thousands of our children, people, and we finally want to end this war. And I want to end our conversation with something positive. And once again, as it's like a Ukrainian channel, I want you to tell some good things about the Ukrainian army, maybe our strategy, something that you consider to be our strong sides and something that can actually and will help us win this war.
I think the Ukrainian army is doing great. I think the pace of innovation, as you talked about before, and why it's so important when you are like the smaller side, it's just super impressive, especially in the area of drones right now. I think Ukraine is a world leader in that right now. Nobody is at the level of both being able to use drone technology, but also to understand what does drone warfare look like. Nobody is at that level right now where Ukraine is, and I'm looking forward to the day when we can start to have Ukrainians coming to us and teaching us what you learned in the war, because it's something that we just don't know how to deal with those kinds of threats at this moment. And so I think if to mention one thing, it would definitely be the drones, but just the whole the whole pace of innovation basically across the whole field and the Ukrainian defense industry. I think it's super impressive what you're doing.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for being on the side of the good. I won't say Ukraine, but all the like sane, healthy world that still respects freedom, choice, possibility to change presidents, not to have them for decades. Ukraine may be imperfect. We have problems, but we are a country that wants to live peacefully in its own legal borders and share our experience, but hopefully no other countries will need this kind of experience. Thank you so much for teaching us a lot. Thank you for standing with Ukraine and coming to the channel. Remember to subscribe to our channels because we both agree not enough information about Russian war in Ukraine and now Russian war in Russia back home. So subscribe, follow the updates, and hopefully sometime soon we will discuss what Ukrainian strategies helped us defeat the monster.